Hello and a very warm welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. I am Naghma. Joining me on this episode is Professor Pant. Before we start the discussion, let me give you a quick look at what all can you expect from this episode. Of course, there is the G7 meeting. There is the Biden-Putin summit, which is being talked about. And it has been a year on the domestic front since the Galwan clash. So what does the India-China relationship look like now after a year of this very fatal clash that took place at the line of actual control? There has been a change of guard in Israel. So all that on this episode of the Ideas Factory. Very warm welcome to you, Harsh. And I would like to begin, if we start with the domestic front and look at where does the India-China relationship really stand after an year of the Galwan clashes, fatal clashes, which will be remembered because there have been many clashes between India and China. But this clash a year back on the 15th of June, how did it really change India-China relationship? We saw that there were many, there were economic sanctions on many Chinese companies in India, sanctions on FDI. There were also bans on a lot of apps, Chinese apps that were operating in India. About 59 Chinese apps were banned. But along with that, there were many rounds of talks which were not really successful. So where do we stand on that front now?
Naghma, it has been an extraordinary year for India-China relations. And I think, I would categorize 2020 almost on par with 1962, because I think it has fundamentally altered our understanding of how this relationship is to be managed. And most of the assumptions that underpinned this relationship or this bilateral engagement have now been upturned by the realities on the ground. So what we have seen in the last few years is certainly India pushing back against China, but also changing the entire template of its China policy. And you see this now being articulated by Indian policymakers repeatedly in different fora, this idea that, border tensions and the remaining relationship cannot move forward. Before 2020, the assumption was that perhaps India can create this wall between border and the other issues. Perhaps we can continue to engage China on the border, which many were arguing is relatively stable. And perhaps we can continue to develop our other aspects of our relationship. Perhaps we can work together on a trade front, people-to-people ties. We can also work on multilateral platforms together. I think that that template has been completely overturned. And we are looking at a relationship that is much more openly contentious. Even in the past, we used to say, it's competitive. There are elements of competition and elements of cooperation. Engagement was a word that is often used. My sense is that we are increasingly moving to a position where cooperative elements are becoming very, very difficult to find. And competition, open conflict is becoming the order of the day. Border, of course, is very, very volatile. Continues to be volatile 1 year after the Galwan Valley incident. We know that only one part of the border dispute around Pangong Tso Lake, where some movement has taken place of disengagement process has begun, but other friction points continue to remain where they are. And India has been pushing for a consolidated border management issue. India has been pushing for a consolidated look at the border question, whereas China, of course, is interested in a piecemeal approach which benefits them. But I don't think that now India can stomach that, or can India in its wisdom take it forward. So what other aspects that you talked about, whether it was finally deciding not to invite Chinese companies for 5G trials, or firewalling certain sectors of Indian economy, they were already happening before, Galwan incident. They were happening in the context of COVID-19 also. But I think what now has happened is a clearer articulation that India and China, perhaps for the foreseeable future, will remain at odds with each other, and India will find that its partnerships with other like-minded countries will grow. And in that context, India's much open embrace of the West has been one of the biggest stories of our times, whether it was G7 or whether it was India's relationship with the Quad, and how the idea of Quad has become much more upfront, and India is no longer ambivalent about those issues. So I think all those changes are happening, but again, given our capability differential, the sense is that we need to manage China. The engagement process has not been completely given up, but as you were pointing out, there has been real movement on the front as far as engagement is concerned, and the results are underwhelming to say the least. So, how far engagement will continue? What form of engagement will we see? And again, we should remember that BRICS is being hosted by India this year. So, what kind of a presence will we see from China, and what kind of issues will be on the agenda? Will be interesting to watch out for. But I think the larger trend lines are relatively clear, and the larger trajectory of Indian foreign policy is also becoming clearer.
All right. Like you said, India is keen to continue the engagement, but the results of the talks have been underwhelming. And at the same time, more than ever, the tension between India and China continues. But at the same time, the good thing is that we've seen an increase in engagement, Indian engagement with Europe, with West particularly, and also the Quad. Before we move on to actually the West, I would like your attention on Israel, the change of guard there. What does it really mean domestically? Because now the coalition government comes with more liberal values, and there are worries within the country of what changes would that bring in? What does it really mean for Palestine? Though it says very clearly that the new Israel government has vowed change, but nothing really in terms of Palestine. So what does it mean for the neighbors as well as Israel domestically?
I think domestically, it seems that the domestic political volatility will continue. Let's remember that it was a matter of one vote that led to the ouster of Mr. Netanyahu
after many long years.
Yes, so I mean, he's not going anywhere, at least, and we know him to be a fighter, so he'll fight back and try to do all the tricks up his sleeve to make sure that his continued relevance in Israeli politics is part of the discussion and debate in Israel. But I think what this government will find it moving forward, the biggest challenge would be to keep the coalition together, because it's a coalition of such disparate elements. You have ultra right and liberals and some Arab Israeli parties together, and the sole agenda was to let Mr. Netanyahu go, or to give him to see a change of guard in Israel. And I think that perhaps will remain the glue in the short term. But I think to maintain this kind of a disparate coalition together is going to be a huge challenge. And that would lead to all sorts of problems, because the decisions that need to be taken, whether it is consolidating ties with neighbors, whether it is reaching out to the US, whether it is reaching out to its traditional partners in the Middle East, as well as deciding on a future track on for the Palestinian question. All of them, for a government that will be crippled from the inside, it will be a very difficult task. So I think at the moment we are all waiting to see whether this government will be able to move on even limited fronts. I mean, what we have seen, for example, on the Gaza issue, we have seen renewed back and forth militarily. We have seen some of the challenges already emanating from that crisis. And what will happen is that Mr. Netanyahu will continue to push from the outside because he's also vulnerable as far as the courts are concerned, Israeli courts are concerned. So there is going to be a lot of turmoil, and I don't see that producing the kind of stability that is perhaps needed both for the future of Israel as well as for the larger conflicts that range in the region.
You're saying that we're going to see a more unstable Israel, domestically at least. The push and pull will continue. Netanyahu's presence is very much there, and we do not really expect the government to be a strong government. Now, let's move on to the G7, Harshan. The President Biden's first overseas trip has put out or displayed his diplomatic philosophy, which was in stark contrast to his predecessor. There were no obvious hugs, there were no confrontations. Most of his meetings took place without cameras, in private. He also, before the sit down with Putin, which we will come to, the G7 meeting that took place, he tried to rally with the allies and bring them all together, which also kind of bolstered his image in front of Russia when he was going for a sit down, and also his stance on China, all of that. But the whole idea that G7 plans to build back a better world, what was the takeaway from this G7 summit? Do you see an agenda that the G7 has, and how does it really compare in terms with the Belt Road Initiative of China, which also plans to bring a lot of countries together?
Well, to be honest, I think this G7 perhaps after a long time seemed a bit more coherent, because I think that, as you point out, Mr. Biden was insistent that he will make a case to his allies, to American allies and partners, and G7 gave him that platform. So my sense is that had been a very important development insofar as the larger coalition of Western democracies, advanced industrialist states is concerned, and their positioning on global issues. Mr. Biden reached out, and I think the Western countries, the European countries in particular, had to respond, because the challenge was that if they do not respond, they would have ended up, making America more withdrawn. So I think the idea was that let's give in to America, let's give in to Mr. Biden's agenda, and let's see if we can work together on global issues, which before this, frankly, the ties seem to be fraying. But at least momentarily, the Western countries have coalesced around certain ideas. Now, some of these ideas are, of course, about economic revival, health, and digital connectivity, etc., which in any case the world is finding it very difficult to deal. So it's for the advanced industrial countries now to take the lead and move forward on those issues. But what was interesting was, I think, this B3W initiative, the infra push that was given to. I think that was led by the Americans. It was not on the agenda till the last minute, and it was certainly pushed by the Americans that this needs to be done, which I think is part of a larger reality that is now sinking in, that China has already stolen a march when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to connectivity, when it comes to economic and developmental aid in the region, across the world. And, advanced industrial nations cannot simply criticize China. They need to put the money where the mouth is. So I think that is the challenge that they are facing, and they are trying to respond to that. We have seen a lot of initiatives happening on the infra connectivity front. We had seen that happening as part of Quad, and now we have seen this happening as part of G7. So I think the idea is to bring to bear all these resources among like-minded countries, and make sure if this works for China, if this works for the rest of the world, and if it can push back against some of the more predatory practices that the Chinese bring with their BRI. Now, again, at this point, it's very unclear how much funding this will have, how this is going to be operationalized. It seems, I think Angela Merkel was the one that said that, we really don't know at this point what kind of money we will be investing here. So I think there are larger realities that the West has to cater to. But the fact that this happened, the fact that there is a larger argument around China, around, the fact that perhaps the West is already late to the party, that is sinking in, and that realization that America will have to work with allies, and allies will have to respond. And that is the larger sort of reality at this point. And that seemed to be the message coming out from G7 and from Biden's outreach to G7 members.
All right, yeah, because though disparities on China continue to pull the US and EU apart. Now, also the Putin and Biden summit in Geneva. I mean, the two leaders were meeting when, there was a baggage, the relationship had hit an all-time low. And US has been accusing Russia of interfering in elections. Russia has been accusing United States. Biden himself had called Putin a killer earlier. And now do a meeting. But the Geneva summit can it be looked at as a kind of reset? Though none of the leaders have called it a reset, but it was very, very pragmatic. There were no obvious confrontations. We all know that there were differences on many issues, whether it was the cyber issue, the interference, but there were also cooperations on smaller areas. So despite these tension over cyber warfare and human rights, etc., continued, they still talked, and they talked face to face. And that was, I mean, Biden himself called it a success because they came face to face. But also, it's being said that Russia is back as a worthy adversary now. So, how do we really look at the Russia-US relationship after this summit?
I think it was, it took us back, I think, to the Cold War era negotiations between American and Soviet leaders partly. And I think that was, if you look at it strategically, it can look like a very smart move, because clearly, as the NATO summit pointed out, China is the largest challenge. Both G7 and NATO, if you look at at their communique, very focused on China, the challenge that China poses across multiple sectors, and the fact that there's a sense that West is losing out, very palpable from these two summits. And in that context, if you bring in Russia, then you can almost see that there is there could have been an attempt to wean Russia away from China. But I think that's being too idealistic at this point. I think what perhaps Mr. Biden and Putin were trying to do were just sit across each other as worthy adversaries and try to lay down some red lines for each other. Because the relationship there are two major powers with significant conflicting interests, at least in Eurasia. Russia is no longer the power that it used to be, but it has a significant element of disruption that it can bring to various agenda items that America might wish to follow. So the challenge for America is that somehow they have to engage with Russia on issues that matter. In Eurasia, some of the issues have global consequences, and so the idea that they should be talking to each other is not something that is very revolutionary. What is interesting is that Mr. Biden is doing it. Democrats had raised hue and cry when Trump used to say that we have to talk to Russians. But I think, and that is, I think, the real challenge here, that Russia has become one of the bigger issues in American domestic politics. So for Mr. Biden to overcome that will be very, even if, for example, his strategic instincts might say, let's do a classic balance of power arrangement with the Russians and see if we can wean them away from China and break the relationship that Russians and Chinese are developing. I think in domestic politics of America, Russia and its perceived interference in electoral systems, in the democratic structures, is now being viewed as a very significant threat. And I think the old memory of Democrats saying that Russia was behind Trump's election also clouds this. So that will prevent, I think, a lot of the ambitions that perhaps Mr. Biden may have with Putin. And therefore, one has to look at this engagement as a limited engagement for limited purposes with a worthy adversary with whom perhaps Americans are trying to come to terms in this new age, and perhaps are looking at ways to see if there is even an iota of possibility of weaning them away from the Chinese. I don't think at this point it looks very likely, but I think if there is a possibility, then Americans should explore that, and it would be good for the world. It would be perhaps good for India to a great degree as well.
So the positive aspect was at least there was a willingness to engage and to reduce tension. So before we end this episode, Harsh, I would like to remind our viewers that they can send in questions. We had taken a break in between for a couple of weeks, but since we've started the show again, you may send in your questions and we will try and take as many as possible, though we will usually have time for one or two. So do send in your questions, and from the next episode, we will include them at the end of the show. That's it from us on this episode. Thank you for joining.